Cognitive biases can be eroded through mindfulness and mindfulness meditation. And there are lots of kinds of cognitive biases. There's the book, what is it? Thinking Fast and Slow by Dan Kahneman and his co-author, I guess. They focus more on the kind of, I would say, almost economic ones, like loss aversion, for example.
Yeah. Why do we
like
hang on to
I
things?
won't pay $10 for a mug like this, and yet if I've already got one, you'll have to pay me 20 to part with it. The paradoxes like that. I think I'm more interested in the less economic cognitive biases, the ones that lead us to judge people unfairly and that
Right.
warp our perception of people. And we know more and more about those. Let me say a little bit about what cognitive empathy is and how it connects to kinds of cognitive biases. Usually when people talk about empathy, they're talking about what's called emotional empathy, feeling their pain, sharing in the emotion of someone, identifying with the emotion of someone. Cognitive empathy is in a way more prosaic and simple sounding, although it can be very hard because it seems as if our brain is engineered to actually keep us from doing it in certain cases. And that's what gets us into trouble. It gets us into personal trouble. It gets us into wars, and so on. But cognitive empathy is just seeing someone's perspective, understanding how they view the world. If you want to see how it can get us into trouble, Dick Cheney, shortly before the Iraq War, said, "I think we will be greeted as liberators." Well, if you'd done a better job of putting yourself in the shoes of the Iraqi people, you would have understood, first of all, there's a lot of different kinds of Iraqi people. A number of them think they're actually benefiting from this regime. There are these different sectarian traditions and so on. So they just hadn't done the work of actually trying to anticipate the perspective of the Iraqi people. And I would say the same thing about Saddam Hussein. When he did a little bit of token resistance, made UN weapons inspectors cool their heels or didn't want them to do certain things. It was easy if you really tried to understand why, given his domestic politics, he would do that even if he didn't have anything to hide. But everyone concluded, oh, he's got something to hide, we have to invade, and so on. So a lack of cognitive empathy can get you into huge trouble.
Give an example or two on the domestic front, too, where you think
Sure.
where you see there's a lack of
just
that.
in terms of how our brains open it up and shut it down. Okay, like I have kids; they're grown up now, but if they were playing on the playground and I saw one of them do something mean to a kid, I might say, well, she saw that kid as a threat, or she was emulating this other kid that she respects who was doing something mean to that kid. And very often I think I'd be on target. I was accurately understanding her because she's my daughter and I want to excuse her bad behavior. Now, sometimes that itself can misfire. You can just imagine, you can come up with invalid rationales. But I assure you that if some child is mean to my child, okay, I am not going to be that charitable. My explanation is going to be, that's a bad kid. That's a mean kid. And I'm not going to even look for a perspective that might explain why the kid did what the kid did. Whereas there must be an explanation, didn't come out of nowhere. And this hooks up with the idea of cognitive biases nicely, because we now know about a cognitive bias called attribution error. Okay. And here's the way it works. Originally they thought that attribution error worked like this. It was kind of one-dimensional, which is that when we're trying to explain somebody's behavior, why they did something, we overemphasize their nature and underemphasize their environment. So if somebody in front of me in the checkout line is rude to the clerk, we say that person's a jerk. That's a kind of natural reaction. We don't say, well, maybe they just found out they have a fatal disease, maybe X, Y, Z. We've all been rude to a clerk after all, and it doesn't mean we're all horrible people. But then as they did more work, they found out it's more subtle. Actually, with our friends and our allies, if they do something good, we attribute it to their nature, to their disposition, to the kind of people they are. If they do something bad, we explain it away. It was peer group pressure. It was, whatever. Or if it's our kids, they didn't get their nap, right? With enemies and rivals, it's the other way around. If they do something bad, that's the kind of people they are. If they do something good, it's just circumstance or just showing off, whatever. So you can see how that bias, which is pretty well documented, gets in the way of accurately understanding people's actual perspectives on the world and their actual motivations in doing things.
And your basic thesis is that you want to be able to do that. You want to be able to understand their perspective and what's driving their actions and motivations so that you're better able to engage with them and not misread their intent, right?
Right. I mean, one of the great starters of wars in the world is to misread things another nation does out of defensive motivation because they find you threatening, to read that as offensive. Okay. It's a well documented by political scientists source of wars. The reason that happens so much is because once you're starting to see a country as an adversary, if they do something that you consider bad, aggressive, belligerent, you're not looking for an explanation based in circumstance. You're just saying, yeah, that's the way they are. And that's why people who want to get us into wars work so hard to demonize the leaders of the other country during the run up to war. Because if they can get you to consider the other leader evil, then they are going to shut down your cognitive empathy when it's going to most matter. And you're going to and you're not going to understand why something that seems belligerent or recalcitrant may not be offensive in motivation.
And not only do they shut down your cognitive empathy, it sounds like they're also amplifying your emotional empathy.
Paul Bloom, the psychologist, writes about when emotional empathy, kind of the more familiar kind of empathy, misfires. And one kind of misfiring is that people who want to get us into wars try to harness emotional empathy in ways that will help them out. So in the run up to the first Iraq War, the so-called Persian Gulf War, there was these congressional hearings, and these supposed Iraqi, I think they were supposedly nurses or something. Turned out it was fake. They weren't. But they got up and testified about how people from Saddam's regime unplugged the incubators in hospitals and killed babies. It was totally made up. But it turned out they worked for a PR firm or something, these supposed nurses. But they were invoking actual empathy. And this would be, I think Paul Bloom would agree. This is an example where emotional empathy can misfire. And sometimes when it's based in truth, it can still draw us in further than it's wise to go. And that's why I think cognitive empathy can be a good check on emotional empathy, although emotional empathy is very often a very valuable thing and is an important resource as well.
Right. So on balance, emotional empathy has both positive firings and negative firings, you could say.
I think so. I think
Yeah.
it's, I mean, it can lead us, because we naturally empathize emotionally with our close relatives sometimes in ways that are not good for us or them, for example. I mean, Buddhist meditation is not the only way to work on your cognitive empathy.
So diagram out your basic idea of how a meditative process could help one improve their cognitive empathy.
Yeah, I would say, first of all, the general premise of Buddhism is that the reason we suffer and the reason we make other people suffer is that we don't see the world clearly. Okay. And this is an example of that. And as you know very well, mindfulness meditation, well, I guess I would say, to get back to when our cognitive empathy is warped by us putting somebody in, say, the rival or enemy category, that's an example of our cognitive process being steered by our feelings, by our emotions, right? And mindfulness meditation can make you more aware of that and better able to head it off at the pass. That's one example. Again, you don't have to meditate to get better at cognitive empathy. You can just read more about, for example, China right now, about what are the people there really thinking? Why do many of them, in fact, support the regime, contrary to the idea that you might get in the American media?
Like meditation seems to be a practice, a discipline, like literally a training regime whereby the capacity of cognitive empathy, I can see being strengthened. If it's left to non-disciplinary measures, I mean, you don't have a regime or a program of training to develop it. I do wonder how I understand some reading more broadly and from a variety of perspectives could bring that, but to the average person, I'm kind of wondering what else might be a way to bolster that.
you're making me think that for the first time that maybe the discipline of meditation is particularly useful in your everyday personal life. Because there's so many things pushing and pulling your mind and warping your cognition and making cognitive empathy in some circumstances hard. Geopolitics is the same way if you feel strongly about a particular country, say, but I do think in the realm of geopolitics, plain old education can really do a lot. And the problem sometimes is just the way media is structured and the way the messaging gets sent out. And that was something Michael was totally attuned to. The one live stream I did with him actually was about China and the threat that we'll get dragged into a long Cold War with China, which he was very much against. And that, I don't know that we use the word cognitive empathy, but we were both trying to cultivate it, I think, without talking about it, and expand the awareness of how the world is viewed by the Chinese leadership and the Chinese people. And my own view is that nobody should be off limits. You should try to apply cognitive empathy to everyone. It can't hurt as long as you are, of goodwill. It doesn't mean forgiving everybody for everything they do. It doesn't mean nobody has to be punished, or you don't have to stand up to anybody.
In mindfulness practice, there's the concept of a mindfulness bell. So it could be a little trigger, or, and to use a behavioral economics term, a nudge in the environment that reminds you to maybe, stop for a second, take a few breaths, be fully present, and kind of cultivate in a punctuated way through your day, cultivate a quality of presence. And it might be good to kind of think of cognitive empathy bells, like what could be a way, a cue to the mind to raise that question, like how else might I be able to see this? Because I know myself, once I get into an emotional zone with something, things start to move quite fast in terms of the thinking fast and slow model, but it's very difficult to step out of that once the flood has begun.
Yeah, I mean, in general, with mindfulness, the problem is forgetting. I mean, right? It's like forgetting to do it. It seems so easy, like on a retreat or something.